You're about to see how Senator Durbin cornered the Attorney General in a tense showdown that erupted into an explosive clash over the Jeffrey Epstein files. It begins with a heated debate over the National Guard, takes a dramatic turn toward a $400 million luxury jet, and ultimately reaches a breaking point with the Epstein investigation. I'll reveal the most critical moment of this confrontation at the very end, so make sure you watch until the finish. Now let's see how it all began.
Were they deployed National Guard troops to cities in the United States?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House.
You won't even say whether you talked to the White House about this?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House with you, Ranking Member.
I noticed that. What's the secret? Why do you want to keep this secret? The American people don't know the rationale behind the deployment of National Guard troops in my state. The word is, and I think it's been confirmed by the White House, they are going to transfer Texas National Guard units to the state of Illinois. What's the rationale for that?
Yeah, Chairman, as you shut down the government, you voted to shut down the government, and you're sitting here, our law enforcement officers aren't being paid. They're out there working to protect you. I wish you loved Chicago as much as you hate President Trump. And currently, the National Guard are on the way to Chicago. If you're not going to protect your citizens, President Trump will.
That response completely changed the tone of the hearing. What Durbin did next was not what most senators do when a legal question turns into a political statement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react emotionally. Instead, he stayed calm and said plainly that in more than 20 years on that committee, he had never seen testimony like this. He added that this was exactly the kind of response he had come to expect from this administration. A straightforward question about the legal basis for deploying National Guard troops to his state had turned into a personal attack, and he pointed that out matter-of-factly, like someone stating something they had been thinking about for a long time. At that moment, the usual political politeness disappeared. Durbin shifted gears. He flipped to another page of notes, and when he resumed, the topic had completely changed. The focus was no longer the National Guard in Chicago. Now, it was Qatar, and this is where the hearing moved beyond a typical oversight session. Durbin carefully laid out the timeline. He reminded Bondi that she had testified under oath about her past work representing the royal family of Qatar. This had been disclosed during her confirmation process, in her Senate Judiciary Questionnaire, and publicly described as international legal consulting tied to the World Cup. But Durbin wasn't questioning the work itself. He was focused on what happened afterward. In May, President Trump accepted a luxury jet worth about $400 million from Qatar's royal family. It was described as a temporary Air Force One replacement, with plans to later transfer it to the Trump Presidential Library Foundation. Months earlier, Durbin had sent Bondi a letter asking a clear question. What legal reasoning did the Department of Justice use to approve this? He argued that the Constitution gives Congress the authority to control whether U.S. officials can accept gifts from foreign governments. He cited that authority directly, calling the jet a clear violation of the law, and he highlighted a key conflict. Bondi, now responsible for advising on the matter, had previously worked for the same foreign government offering the gift. But the most intense part of the hearing was still ahead. Bondi's response was calm, structured, and firm. She drew a clear distinction between her past private work and her current role. She said her Qatar-related work had been fully disclosed and focused on anti-human trafficking efforts tied to the World Cup. Work she said she was proud of. When it came to the legal advice given to the president, she set a boundary. Any guidance from the Office of Legal Counsel, she explained, is confidential. That rule applied here, just as it always does. She would not discuss what advice was given or who provided it. The discussion then shifted to federal law enforcement grants in Illinois. Durbin argued that the administration was cutting funding while sending National Guard troops into states without governor's approval. He said this was neither cooperative nor bipartisan, and that it ultimately made communities less safe. He pointed to the HITTA program as a specific example, noting its budget had been reduced from $300 million to $196 million. Bondi pushed back. She said only 7% of grants had been cut, and none of those cuts targeted programs protecting law enforcement. She offered to personally review any specific case in Illinois and noted that she had worked with Democrats to restore funding through appeals. She even challenged Durbin, saying he had never brought a specific case to her. Regarding Hitta, she clarified that the funding hadn't disappeared. It had simply been transferred to the Office of Justice Programs, which would continue managing it in 2026. Then Durbin shifted again, this time to the issue that would push the hearing to its breaking point: Jeffrey Epstein. He referenced a public statement Bondi had made in February, where she said the Epstein client list was on her desk for review. That statement had drawn major attention, but later, during a White House event, she presented what Durbin described as already public information, with no client list. His question was direct. Why make that claim and then produce nothing? Bondi responded just as directly. She said her full statement had been misunderstood. She had clearly said she had not yet reviewed the files, which included Epstein documents along with JFK and Martin Luther King files. She also pointed to a July 6 memo from her office stating there was no client list to release. Before moving on, she briefly returned to the grant discussion to ensure the record was complete. But Durbin wasn't finished with Epstein. He introduced a whistleblower claim, stating that Bondi had pushed the FBI to review around 100,000 Epstein-related records on a tight deadline in March. According to the claim, agents were told to flag any documents mentioning President Trump. Nothing came from that review until July, when an unsigned memo declared there was no incriminating client list. His question was simple: why was the memo unsigned? Bondi replied that the memo came jointly from the FBI and the Department of Justice, and that Director Patel had already addressed the issue. Then she made a sharp pivot. She accused Durbin of previously blocking Republican efforts to release Epstein flight logs. She questioned whether he had received campaign donations from Reid Hoffman, whom she described as connected to Epstein. And she asked why he had resisted disclosure for years. That shift from defense to direct counterattack transformed the exchange into something far more intense than a typical Senate hearing.
Back to the Epstein files, according to another whistleblower who made a protected disclosure to my office, you pushed the FBI to review approximately 100,000 Epstein-related records on an arbitrarily short deadline in March, and the FBI was directed to flag any documents that mentioned President Trump. Nothing came of that review until July, when DOJ and FBI released an unsigned memo stating, quote, "there's no incriminating client list." Why was the July 7th memo unsigned?
The July 7th memo came from the FBI and the Department of Justice. Director Patel answered those questions very clear. And, you know, Senator Durbin, I find it very interesting that you refused repeated Republican requests to release the Epstein flight logs in 2023 and 2024. You fought that. Did you take money from Reid Hoffman, campaign donations, who was a huge Epstein friend? Why did you fight for years? Why did you fight to not disclose the flight logs, Senator Durbin?
I can tell you I did not refuse. One of the senators here wished to produce those logs, and I asked her to put it in writing, and she never did.
Yeah, I think Senator Blackburn would quarrel with you on that.
Well, I will quarrel with you as to Reid, somebody that you mentioned I never heard of.
Reid Hoffman.
So who gave the order to flag records related to President Trump?
To flag records for President Trump?
To flag any records which included his name.
I'm not going to discuss anything about that with you.
Ultimately, this exchange revealed a complete breakdown of the traditional Senate oversight process. Normally, the structure is predictable. Senators ask questions, cabinet officials respond or decline within accepted limits, and both sides stay, at least formally, within the rules of the proceeding. But that's not what happened here. This shift didn't happen instantly. It built slowly throughout the hearing. And by the final moments, the gap between what the hearing was supposed to be and what it had become was impossible to ignore. Look at Durbin's approach. He came in prepared, with clear questions, documented timelines, reference letters, constitutional arguments, and specific figures. Whether you agree with him or not, his method was structured. Each question connected to the next. He moved step by step, from the National Guard to the Qatar jet, to federal grants, and finally to the Epstein files. He was building a case, piece by piece, and he stayed focused even when the answers didn't directly address his questions. Bondi, on the other hand, was just as consistent, but operating under a completely different framework. She refused to discuss internal White House conversations. She declined to reveal legal advice given to the president. She leaned on confidentiality and institutional norms. And when she disagreed with the premise of a question, she didn't just answer it. She redirected the conversation. She brought up Chicago crime rates, the grant appeal process, the hit-to-funding shift, and even Durbin's past position on Epstein flight logs. These weren't random deflections. They were deliberate responses, signaling that she rejected the assumptions behind his questions. The Epstein portion is where everything became most intense and most significant. It's also where the disconnect between questions and answers became the clearest. Durbin asked a straightforward procedural question. Why was the July 7th memo unsigned? That's a factual issue. There should be a clear reason. Either it exists in the record or it doesn't. Bondi responded by saying, the memo came from both the FBI and the Department of Justice, and that Director Patel had already addressed it. That was her answer. But then she pivoted hard. She turned the focus back on Durbin. She questioned whether he had taken campaign donations from Reid Hoffman, whom she linked to Epstein. She challenged his record on releasing flight logs. She even pointed to another senator who she claimed would dispute his version of events. Durbin pushed back on every point. He denied receiving money, denied blocking the release of logs, and said he had simply asked for a written request that never came. Then, almost immediately, he returned to his central question: who ordered the FBI to flag records mentioning President Trump? Bondi's answer was the same as before. She wasn't going to discuss it. And that's where the real divide becomes clear. This wasn't just disagreement. It was a fundamental clash over what this process is supposed to achieve. Durbin's closing remarks made his position clear. He signaled that this issue wasn't over, that the questions remained unanswered, and that accountability would come later, if not now. Bondi, however, never accepted that her answers were insufficient. From her perspective, she upheld legal boundaries, protected confidential processes, and responded where appropriate. She wasn't silent. She was selective, answering on her own terms. That difference between what one side believes should be answered and what the other believes must remain protected is the real story of this hearing. This wasn't just about Chicago crime, federal grants, or even the Epstein memo. Those are important issues, but they're not the core conflict. The deeper question is this: what does an attorney general owe Congress? And what does Congress have the right to demand? There's no simple answer. And this hearing didn't resolve it. What it did do is expose that tension clearly, publicly, and on the record. In the end, this exchange shows exactly what happens when the usual rules of Washington stop working. Now I want to hear from you. Who do you think had the upper hand here, Senator Durbin or Attorney General Bondi? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. And if you want more raw, unfiltered breakdowns of the most intense hearings in the country, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.